What's up, everybody? This is MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot Lab, continuing my Moving Up the Stake series. Today I'm going to cover my NL50 footage. I recorded it a few weeks ago and I'm going to just break down all the hands in depth. In case you haven't seen the previous videos, I highly recommend going ahead and watching them first. So we're moving up to NL50 today, which means our opponents are a little bit better than at NL25. You're starting to see some professionals and semi-professionals, so the games are a little bit tougher, so we'll have to shift our strategy just a little bit. So every time we move up in stakes, we have to play a slightly more fundamentally sound game plan. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I play the footage. So let's start. So table 2, top right, of course, I open Jack 8 suited, which is quite close. I would say sometimes opening this hand, sometimes folding. The reason I don't really like my open raise too much is because the cutoff doesn't have a full stack, which means he's going to overcall a lot. And this hand plays okay out of position, but not fantastically well. You're also going to get squeezed quite a bit. So in retrospect, I would have liked a fold and just opened, Jack 8 suited, Jack 9 suited plus, I'm sorry. So slight mistake to start off with. One of the reasons I actually picked this footage is because I didn't think I played very well. My adjustments to the player pool were mediocre, to be honest. So I'm going to critique my own play and hopefully get better myself. Pocket 4s here is an easy fold. We're facing a 3x open raise, so calling doesn't really make sense, especially with the high rake. And 10 unsuited against a big 3-bet. Again, flat calling doesn't really work very well. It would work better given that you're in position at least. I would like to see myself 3-bet here. Villain is going to have to respond quite tight because of the rake and just because he'd be calling a big 3-bet out of position. So if you always 3-bet 10 unsuited, 8-7 suited, ace-5 suited, etc., you'd be overdoing it. But you cannot only 3-bet hands like aces, kings, ace-king, because when the board's Broadway cards, you don't have any air anymore. And when the board's middling cards, the best you can really have is a one-pair over a pair, in which case you'd be in big trouble, especially with deeper stacks. So it's very important to diversify your 3-bet range. Queen 6-3 here on table 2 is a fine board. You could end up c-betting small if you like. My backdoors are not particularly great. If I wanted to c-bet, at least have an overcard, or at least a backdoor straight draw, at least a backdoor open-ender, whereas here I can only have backdoor gut shots. So I don't really like a bet very much. I would like to see myself just check fold. And despite the small bet size, I don't like a check raise or a check call. And with queen deuce here, I happily will see a flop. I would not really recommend raising much with these types of trashy hands against people who are probably not going to limp fold a whole lot. Now, if you have a read that they do fold a lot, then it's fine, but I don't know anything about these players, so I'm not going to make any assumptions. So villain pretty quickly checks behind on a board, which is obviously great for his range. Even if he limps a wide range, he's still going to have maybe some aces and kings, or just one pairs, under pairs like pocket queens, pocket tens, etc. So I'm not going to be very aggressive here. My one big advantage is 5 deuce here, because if I were to have 5 deuce, offsuit or suited in the big blind, I would just end up checking. So I will have about 16 straights here, which means that I can overbet with some of these hands sometimes, right? I do block a hand like ace, queen, king, queen, which check behind, or a hand like queens, for instance, or even a hand like queen, jack that's, that's beating me. So I can lead out and have a bit of fold equity, and I have gotcha to the nuts. But that's something you don't want to do too aggressively in this spot. When villain checks behind in a spot that's so good for him, he likely has something. And just barreling once is not going to work very effectively. Now I river a deuce, and I can beat some hands like queen high, etc. So I'd like to see myself just check. I have hands like 5-7 and 8-6 offsuit, all that type of stuff that can bluff. So we don't need to bluff with a pair with a decent kicker. In fact, the best kicker. King Jack 4 is a board where you can probably c-bet full range for a third or a quarter of the pot, especially button versus big blind, where my range is not very strong. Now, I defended it 9-8 off, which is loose, but I agree with. There's a ton of natural bluffs on this turn for me. Queen 10, Queen 9, 10 9, 7 5, 5 3, 8 7. And you can even pick slightly weaker bluffs, as in like hands like ace 10 or 5 deuce. We really don't need to end up bluffing a hand like this. We're just going to check the turn, represent something like a slow play that we wanted to check raise, or a hand like a jack, or some kind of Henry river, and then we lead out on the river and pretend to have it. I like this bet size a lot. Very good bet size by Villain. It's a very dry board where I will just check fold a lot, even facing a small bet. And this puts me in a tough spot with a lot of ace highs and weaker pairs. So very good play by Villain. I'm not a big fan of the check back on the flop, but I do like the turn play quite a bit. So I open ace queen offsuit in the small blind here, and we get called by a player who doesn't have a full stack. That means there's a decent chance this player is not a professional. Queen 10-7 is a board you have to mix it up on. Betting full range 1/3 pot doesn't really work very well in my opinion, because Villain will have 10-7 suited, queen 10 off, king queen, hands like king jack and jack 9 and jack 8 and all kinds of one pair hands and overcards and gut shots, etc. So it's not a board that's so dry that Villain will just quickly fold versus a small bet. So the options are either check raising or betting. Now, most players who are not professionals tend to be on the passive side, on the loose passive side. So they will put in quite a bit of money if you make them by betting, but they tend to be careful themselves. So I prefer a bet here in general. Unless I ever read that this Villain is very aggressive with stabs, I think a bet is a little bit better. Now, I do check, which I think is not the best play, but it is a good play overall. You cannot just check hands like pocket sixes and ace jack and nothing, right? Because then you end up just check folding the flop, or maybe you call once, and then when your opponent overbets the turn, you're no man's land. You can't really fight back. So I do like the fact that I strengthened my range, but I think the timing was a little bit off. The nice thing about having a hand like ace queen here is that you unblock all of Villain's air, right? So hands like king jack, jack 9, 8 9, a lot of those are going to stab, and you unblock all of them, right? Whereas a hand like queen jack would do a better job of blocking some of his bluffs. Now on the turn, I would like to see myself bet once again. Villain likely has some kind of weak draw or decent pair, and we can get quite a bit of value. Double check raising would not be the worst play. And with pocket 10s here, if you wanted to have a flatting range, 10s would be a decent flat calling hand. In fact, you'd 3-bet and flat call this one at a pretty similar frequency. But, but for the sake of the video, I'm trying to avoid paying rake, and that means I'm going to play a 3-bet or fold strategy here. If you were playing this hand at, let's say, 500 zoom, flat calling would definitely be part of a good strategy. So I tried the check raise again, and again Villain didn't fall for it. Now I'd like to see myself just bet on the big side, get quite a bit of value here. Five deuce suited against 3x is an easy fold. The hand is actually somewhat playable, but not versus a 3x raise. And now we get 4-bet here with 10s. And I would like you guys to be very careful in these spots. Villain 4-bet kind of small, and I would have to go back, but I'm pretty sure it was quite quickly. So when he 4-bets under the gun versus button at MMANL50, most players are way too tight. And when they have a hand like aces or kings, they'll actually give you a better price because they really want to get called. And then next time they have a hand like ace king, which they just want to get in or, at least get a fold with, they'll just 4-bet quite large. So in theory, this hand would be like 100% call. We would never shove here. We'd never fold here. But if anything, I want you guys to be a little bit tighter because I don't expect these opponents to be aggressive enough. Now, I don't know this player. He could have a really weak hand and like ace-3 suited, but I think we just have to fold. I do end up calling, which again, I think is the correct play in theory, but I'm making too many theoretical plays and I'm not really adjusting to the pool enough. I remember not long before this session, I was playing against very, very tough players, so I was perhaps still a bit in theory mode and not trying to exploit enough. 9-6-5 is not the worst board for me. I can have a couple of hands like, for instance, 6-5 suited, 8-7 suited. I can maybe have a hand like pocket 9 sometimes. I mean, I have 10, so It's not crazy to say I'd have pocket nines as well. I can have flush draws, etc. So villain should definitely employ some kinds of checks. However, this is not a board on which he needs to check full range. Yes, I'm ahead of him sometimes, but if he has hand like kings, he's more than happily getting it in. Now, if we're, let's say, 500 big blinds deep, now that changes quite a bit, right? Because I've got 8-7 and he probably doesn't. But with about 2x pot behind, that's not very relevant, and he would just want to pump in as much money as he can with overpairs. So he can do that by check raising or by betting. He does not need to check full range. So villain ends up checking here. Versus a check, you should expect to get check raised all in quite frequently. However, again, it's not a play I expect very often. I would expect most villains to just bet pretty big or bet small and shove turns and not really check raise all in very frequently. So in theory, you often check this hand behind because you really don't want to get check raised, but you do have the best hand quite a bit. I do think we can just bet small here and potentially even bet fold because I don't believe our opponents will check raise much. So we get a little bit of value, we get a lot of protection, we retain the initiative, and we can just fold knowing that villain is likely not going to take a hand like ace-8 and check raise all in, right? Or take a hand like ace-king of clubs and check raise all in. Now, can he take a hand like ace-king of hearts and check raise all in? Absolutely. But ace-king of hearts and maybe like ace-10 of hearts don't outweigh all of the overpairs he may be check raising all in. So a very small bet is in order, in my opinion. If you think your opponent is very good at mixing things up, very tricky and deceptive, you would have to be more careful. And he does very quickly check fold, which means he probably had a hand like ace-queen offsuit with no backdoors. Next hand, we've got ace-9 suited and the cutoff flat calls. 8-4 deuce is not a very scary board. I suspect villain does have 8s quite frequently, 4s and deuces much less frequently, and he can't have high equity straight draws, flush draws, etc. So I do believe we need to have a c-bet range. If it's a board that hits villain quite hard and he has a lot more sets, straight draws and pairs, etc., we could end up checking our full range, but on a board on which villain doesn't really have much, I think checking full range is not the correct play. So auto-checking 100% of boards is definitely not the correct strategy, especially facing villains who could be calling way too much. So with ace-9 suited, we've got a decent hand. We've blocked 8-9 suited. We block pocket nines, which is a pair he could definitely be flat calling. We have a backdoor flush draw and a backdoor straight draw with the ace. It's also a hand that doesn't perform very well while check calling. We're basically hoping that villain stabs nothing and gives up. But then if he were to bet the river, we really can't call anymore. So I like just betting here. I'm betting around half pot. Villain is Ukrainian, which means he's probably pretty good. I mean, when was the last time you guys saw a bad Ukrainian player? Very unlikely, right? He quickly raises. He's not really representing very many hands, but unfortunately, there's not much we can do with ace-9 suited. So I do like my play. Eight-9 offsuit with very low rake, we could end up calling, but definitely not with high rake. A7 off is kind of the same thing. I would rather call with 8-9 off. Your hand is less dominated and more connected. A7 is dominated, offsuit, and just doesn't play very well. If you flop an ace and villain doesn't have one, you likely have him almost dead, but you're not going to get much money out of him. Very easy fold. I like it. Let's hope we get some action with the ace-king. Preferably not by under the gun. Okay. Ace-jack suited would be an easy call against a 3-bet. Ace-jack offsuit, we could sometimes end up 4-bet bluffing. And ace-6 off, this is actually pretty close. Even with mid-stakes rake, this is mostly call, but sometimes a fold. So with the higher rake, I actually believe I should have folded here. Now, I am partially calling because I think I can outplay these guys a little bit, but theoretically, at least, I think ace-6 is just a fold. Ace-5 is significantly better than ace-6. And so here on queen 9, queen 9-6 is a lot worse for us than 8-4 deuce was. because villain in position can have sixes, nines, probably not pocket queens, but he can definitely have king queen suited, maybe king queen offsuit, ace queen offsuit, queen 10 suited, queen jack suited. He can have straight draws like king jack and king 10 and 8-7 and perhaps 10-8. The list goes on and on. And Daddy Beer can have most of the same hands, right? So this board is a lot worse for us than the previous one. So here I would not mind ending up checking my full range. Even if you were to bet, you'd have to bet small, and we still wouldn't bet very often. I do expect the button to have 9s and 6s virtually 100% of the time. Once again, we see a player check behind here. You're seeing a lot of checking behind in these games, likely with somewhat weak ranges. If I were to overbet here with ace-6, I believe I can just get villain to fold almost everything. He'll likely check behind the weaker king sometimes. He'll check behind a hand like pocket 4 sometimes. But other than that, I think I can run over my opponent. So I remember actually checking, which is an okay play, but in theory, a6 would be checked quite a bit just because we have a lot of showdown value. But a villain will be realizing a decent amount of equity. And also, that range is built on villain checking behind, stronger kings and pocket kings and straight draws like 8-6 and not continue. I don't believe the average villain will do that, so you can run over your opponent a little bit more than in theory. So villain does check behind once again, and we river an ace. Unfortunately, this card is really good for villain. Villain is likely going to check back hands like ace, queen, ace, jack, etc., which we don't beat. So I'd like to see us just check call. Having a 6 is actually great, not because we block the straight, that's not really relevant anymore, but what are villain's bluffs, right? Villain's bluffs usually contain a queen, jack, 10, 8, 9. Right? Those are the cards, and we don't hold any of them. So a villain had a hand like jack 10, maybe he doesn't always bet the flop, he checks the turn because he doesn't really improve, and on the river he thinks, well, I block ace, jack, ace 10, I'm bluffing. So this hand is actually great for calling, both because obviously we have top pair in a small pot, which is fantastic, but also we do a great job of not blocking our opponent's bluffs. 10-8 suited is an easy open raise. And we face his like slightly under 70% pot bet, easy call. Villain could even maybe value bet like a hand like ace 3 or ace deuce, or maybe even a king. And he does have ace queen, which is perfectly fine. 10-8 suited here, as I said, fine open raise, and this board is definitely one we need to check on, especially with 10-8 suited. Meanwhile, 9-7 got checked through, and I didn't believe my opponent had anything. Again, you're seeing a lot of passivity, and if you're the one who tries to push people around and pick up a lot of pots, a lot of villains will not fight for it. So I like my play there. 10-8 gets checked through. I would expect the average villain to not check behind a super strong range, and even though they kind of should. The 9 doesn't really help him that much. Villain can have a hand like maybe 9s, maybe 10-9, maybe ace-9. So he mostly improves with hands like queen jack now being an open ender, etc. So I would like to still see myself check. Getting raised would be a disaster here. At the same time, our hand is looking pretty good now. So I wouldn't hate a third pot bet, but I think checking is slightly better. And with queen 8 suited, we can kind of go crazy here. The small blind may have pocket deuces for one combination and pocket 4s. He may also have hands like pocket 8s, which we actually block. But other than that, maybe 7s, 6s, etc. He doesn't really have anything. And the same goes for the big blind. The big blind may have a couple more 4s than we do, but he doesn't have big overpairs. He doesn't have any straight draws, so we can barrel with overcards very aggressively. We block 8-4 suited, we block pocket 8s, we block queen 4 suited. So this is a decent hand to be barreling as a bluff. Obviously, you cannot just barrel every single type of overcard because then you end up way overdoing it, so be careful. But if anything, continuing with the trend of being slightly overly aggressive, this hand will be barreled quite frequently. Against a little bit over half pot easy call, we're beating hands like under pairs plus spade, queen jack, king queen. Maybe villain even merge bets a weaker hand sometimes like 9-8 or 6-7. And we do river 2 pair, but with the double 4 straight, I don't think we can end up betting here. It's also not a card that improves our range that much. It's not as if we now have a gigantic amount of flushes or a gigantic amount of Jack X, so I don't think we need a leading range. Generally, if you consider leading, it should be on a card that changes things quite a bit. So when we check all, we're saying our hand is good enough to call, but we're not doing well enough to raise. Now on this river, we are far ahead of you, so we're going to lead out because we don't want you to end the hand. But this card doesn't change anything in our favor. For instance, let's say you button versus cutoff, you check call on Queen Jack X and the turn is a 10 or the river's a 10. Perhaps you would want to lead because we can have a decent amount of ace king combinations, but villain obviously never would have ace king button versus cutoff. So since we now have a gigantic straight advantage, especially the nut straight, we can employ a leading range, but not on a card like this. And villain check behind with a weak top pair, bet the turn. Seems like a fine play, actually. I think 3-betting pre-flop would also be a good play. I 3-bet ace-king here, MP versus under the gun, and villain calls. His range should be extremely tight for calling here. Jacks should be getting 4-bet a decent amount, although I do expect them to just get called. 7s and deuces should be folded a decent amount, although I do expect villain to overcall them. And then villain should just call very few hands. Almost every single hand is a mix here. My hand is pretty good to bet with, especially multiple streets when diamonds come in. We block ace-jack suited, we block king-jack suited. We can use the nut flush blocker to our advantage, so... And, I mean, by betting here, we also just clear out a lot of hands with a decent amount of equity. So I like betting here. The board is quite draw-heavy, as in there's a couple of gut shots out there, overcards, flush draw, so I don't want to see a third pot bet here. Around half pot, I think, is far better. And with 8-3, similar to the queen deuce 10 minutes ago, happily seeing a flop. 3 ace kings in one... at 4 tables, that's impressive. So villain thinks a little bit and then decides to check call. Ace king could definitely be in his range. Ace queen of diamonds, well, in theory is in his range. Obviously not, since we have the ace of diamonds. And then maybe he'll float hands like ace queen of hearts, etc. So villain can definitely have this ace, but not as often as we do. So I do think we can, with specifically ace king, so with a good kicker as well as the diamond for protection, I think we can usually end up betting here. Very important to also check back a strong range. We'd be interested in checking back hands like a weaker ace, a 10, or like pocket 10s, a jack, hands like queens and kings, right? If we had a hand like absolutely nothing, maybe 6-5 of clubs, let's say, or even hearts, we wouldn't really want to bet. So it's important you check back a strong range, so when villain leads into you on the river, you can still call, you can still raise, you can still bet for value and put your opponent in a tough spot. So very important to mix it up. Ace king specifically is just a pretty good hand to be betting with. If we had any like pocket aces or pocket jacks, I would like a check back a little bit more, because now it's very difficult for villain to call us with not with the worst hand. I mean, we have the best possible hand, but we block a lot of villain's continuing range, right? Whereas now we block far fewer hands he will continue with. 10-8 offsuit is a combination of open and fold. I think I can get away with opening to this hand every single time. And king-jack, once again, it's a combination of 3-bet and fold. I don't mind being slightly overly aggressive and 3-betting here. Six deuce easy fold. And king-jack would be a terrible call against a 4-bet. We just got to let it go. Our hand is dominated. Well, we're definitely folding against all in. Our hand is dominated. Our hand is not suited. It's just not very playable, so easy fold. If we had king-jack suited against a good opponent, we would end up calling. It's not the greatest hand to call with, but it would be winning.